The bus ride from the federal courthouse in Manhattan to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn took 45 minutes, but to Nicolás Maduro, it felt like hours. He sat in the back of the prison transport vehicle, hands cuffed to a chain around his waist, ankles shackled together, listening to the sounds of New York City traffic through the reinforced windows. This was his life now. Not motorcades with screaming sirens and blocked intersections. Not private jets and diplomatic immunity. Just a prisoner being transferred from one cage to another, indistinguishable from any other criminal in the federal system. The other prisoners on the bus were younger, mostly. Men in their 20s and 30s, covered in tattoos, speaking in languages Maduro recognized, Spanish, English, some Russian. They glanced at him occasionally, with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. One of them, a young Latino with gang markings on his neck, stared at Maduro for a long moment, before leaning over to whisper something to his companion. Both men laughed. Maduro kept his eyes forward, maintaining the same neutral expression he'd perfected over decades of political life. Never show weakness. Never let them see fear. It was a lesson that had served him well in Venezuelan politics, and he suspected it would be even more critical in federal prison. The Metropolitan Detention Center loomed into view as the bus turned onto an access road in the Sunset Park neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like any other institutional building, concrete and glass, functional and ugly. But Maduro had heard the stories about MDC Brooklyn, even aboard the USS Iwo Jima. Even during his processing in Manhattan, guards and officials had mentioned it with a particular tone. The worst federal facility in New York. Overcrowded, understaffed. Violence was common. Guards were often overwhelmed, and during a power failure the previous winter, hundreds of inmates had gone days without heat in freezing temperatures. This was where they were sending him to await trial. Not to some minimum security facility for white-collar criminals. Not to a federal camp where former politicians and corporate executives played tennis and took college courses. To MDC Brooklyn, one of the harshest pre-trial detention centers in the federal system. The message was clear. Despite his former status, despite the high-profile nature of his case, the United States government wanted him to suffer. The bus pulled into a secure garage. Heavy doors closed behind them with a sound that seemed to echo with finality. Maduro and the other prisoners were unloaded one by one, processed through a security checkpoint, and then lined up against a wall while guards reviewed paperwork and assigned housing units. Maduro Nicolás, a guard called out, mispronouncing his first name in a way that made it sound like Nicholas. Unit 3 South. Medium security general population. General population. The words hit Maduro like a physical blow. He'd assumed, perhaps naively, that someone with his profile would be placed in protective custody or special housing, isolated from other inmates for his own safety. But apparently, the Bureau of Prisons had made a different calculation, or maybe they simply didn't care if a former Venezuelan president got hurt by other inmates. Maybe they thought he deserved whatever happened to him. The intake process took 3 hours. Strip search, medical screening, psychological evaluation, assignment of prison number and housing unit. They gave him bedding, toiletries, and 2 sets of khaki prison uniforms. The orange jumpsuit from his initial custody was replaced with standard federal issue, khaki pants, khaki shirt, khaki jacket. At least he wouldn't stand out visually from every other inmate. Small mercies in a situation with very few mercies. A guard escorted him through a series of locked doors and corridors to Unit 3 South. The sounds of the prison grew louder as they walked, voices echoing off concrete walls, metal doors slamming, occasional shouts. The smell was distinctive too, disinfectant mixed with body odor, industrial food, and something indefinable that Maduro would come to recognize as the scent of confinement itself. "You're in cell 317, the guard said, stopping in front of a heavy steel door with a narrow window. "You've got a cellie already. Name's Rodriguez. Try not to cause problems." The door opened electronically. Maduro stepped inside, and it closed behind him with that same sound of finality he'd heard in every locked door since his capture. The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, barely larger than the isolation cell aboard the Iwo Jima. But this one was designed for 2 people, bunk beds bolted to the wall, a small metal desk with a fixed stool, a toilet sink combination with no privacy, and sitting on the lower bunk, looking up at Maduro with undisguised hostility, was his new cellmate. Rodriguez was younger, maybe early 40s, with prison muscles and tattoos covering both arms. His face was hard, weathered in a way that suggested he'd spent significant time in the system, and his expression made clear that he was not happy about having a roommate. "You're the Venezuelan," Rodriguez said in Spanish. Not a question, a statement. "Nicolás Maduro." "Yes. I'm José Rodriguez. Brooklyn-born, Puerto Rican family. Been here 8 months waiting for trial on weapons charges. And I don't like politicians." He said it flatly, matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than making a threat. "I didn't ask to be placed here," Maduro said carefully. "Neither of us had a choice." "True enough. So here's how this works. Top bunk is yours. You don't touch my shit. You don't talk to me unless necessary. You keep your side of the cell clean. You don't snore too loud. And most importantly, you don't bring your problems to this cell. Because if your political bullshit causes trouble for me, we're going to have a serious problem." Maduro nodded. "Understood. Good. Dinner's in an hour. Chow hall. You'll see how things work around here. And Maduro, be careful. There's guys in here from all over Latin America, Venezuela, Colombia, El Salvador, Honduras. A lot of them have family back home who suffered because of shit you did. Some of them might want payback." The warning hung in the air as Maduro climbed onto the top bunk and tried to organize his minimal possessions. This was his home now, 8 feet by 10 feet of concrete and steel, shared with a hostile stranger, surrounded by hundreds of inmates who might view him as an enemy. He thought about the presidential palace, about the spacious rooms and comfortable furnishings he'd taken for granted for so many years, about privacy and security, and the ability to simply be alone when he wanted. All of that was gone, replaced by this brutal new reality where every moment would be a negotiation, every interaction potentially dangerous. The hour passed slowly. Rodriguez lay on his bunk reading a legal document, occasionally making notes in margins with a stubby pencil. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Maduro's presence beyond that initial warning. When the announcement came over the intercom, Unit 3 South, chow time, Rodriguez stood and walked to the door without looking back. Maduro followed, trying to appear calm despite the anxiety churning in his stomach. The chow hall was chaos. 200 inmates from multiple units, all crammed into a space designed for maybe half that number. The noise was overwhelming. Conversations in a dozen languages, the clatter of metal trays, guards shouting orders. Maduro got in line, collected his tray of unidentifiable food, and looked for somewhere to sit. Rodriguez had already joined a group at one of the tables, making clear through body language that Maduro was not welcome. Other tables were full or dominated by groups that radiated territorial hostility. Maduro finally found a seat at the end of a table where a few isolated inmates sat in careful neutrality. He'd taken maybe 3 bites when he felt someone standing behind him. "You're Maduro." The voice was young, heavily accented, speaking Spanish with the particular cadence of Central America. Maduro turned to see 3 men, all in their 20s, all covered in the distinctive tattoos of MS-13, the most feared gang in Central America, with a presence throughout the U.S. prison system. "Yes," Maduro said, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm Maduro. My family is from El Salvador," the lead gang member said. "San Salvador. They left because there was no work, no food, no future, because your government fucked up Venezuela so bad that it destabilized the whole region. Your corruption, your incompetence, your deals with cartels, all of that made things worse for everyone. I'm sorry for your family's suffering," Maduro said carefully, "but I'm not sure what you expect me to do about it from a prison cell." "Nothing. We don't expect you to do shit. We just wanted you to know that we see you, and we remember. And in here you're not a president. You're just another prisoner." and prisoners who hurt our families. They don't have an easy time." The three men walked away, but the message was unmistakable. Maduro had enemies in this facility. People who viewed his prosecution not as political persecution, but as justice. People who might take it upon themselves to deliver additional punishment beyond what the courts would impose. Maduro tried to eat, but his appetite was gone. He returned his tray and walked back to his cell, aware of eyes following him, whispers in his wake. By the time lockdown came at 9 p.m., his nerves were frayed. Rodriguez returned to the cell and immediately went to his bunk without speaking. The lights dimmed but didn't go completely dark. Maduro lay on the thin mattress, staring at the concrete ceiling just inches from his face, and tried to process the reality of his situation. This was just the first day. He had months ahead of him in this facility, waiting for trial. Months of navigating gang politics, avoiding violence, enduring the daily humiliations of prison life. And if he was convicted, when he was convicted, based on the evidence against him, the sentence would be measured in decades. He might spend the rest of his life in places like this, or worse. The thought was almost paralyzing in its horror. He was 62 years old. Statistically, he had maybe another 15 or 20 years of life. All of it could be spent in cages like this one, surrounded by enemies, stripped of every dignity, counting down the days until death provided the only escape. "You crying up there?" Rodriguez's voice cut through the darkness. "No," Maduro lied. "Good. Because if you're going to be a little bitch about this, I'm requesting a cell transfer tomorrow. I got enough problems without a roommate who can't handle his situation. I can handle it. We'll see. Now shut up and go to sleep. Some of us got legal motions to work on in the morning." The second day began at 6 a.m. with a count. Guards walking the tier, checking that every inmate was present and accounted for. Then breakfast, which was even worse than dinner had been. Powdered eggs, burnt toast, coffee that tasted like chemicals. Maduro ate mechanically, keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact with other inmates. After breakfast came free time in the day room, a communal space with a few tables, a broken television, and mostly broken or missing recreation equipment. Maduro tried to find a quiet corner, but one of the MS-13 members from the previous night approached him. "Hey, Presidente," the gang member said with exaggerated respect. "You want to play dominoes? We need a fourth." It wasn't really a question. Declining would be interpreted as disrespect, which could escalate the situation. Maduro nodded and followed the man to a table where two others were waiting. They played for an hour, and Maduro lost every game, sometimes spectacularly. The gang members laughed, made jokes at his expense, and generally treated him like entertainment. But it could have been worse. They could have been violent. They could have done more than mock him. This was just testing, Maduro realized. Seeing how he would react to humiliation. Seeing if he would break or fight back or handle it with some measure of dignity. He chose dignity, accepting the losses and the mockery without complaint, and eventually they got bored and let him leave. "You did okay," Rodriguez said later, back in their cell. It was the first, almost positive thing he'd said. "Those guys were feeling you out, seeing if you're weak. You didn't give them much to work with." "I've dealt with difficult people before," Maduro said. "Not like this, you haven't. In prison, everything's different. Status, money, connections, none of that matters. All that matters is how you carry yourself and whether you can back it up if someone tests you. You're old, you're out of shape, and you don't know how to fight. That makes you prey, unless you're smart about it. So what do I do? Keep your head down. Don't get involved in other people's business. Don't borrow. Don't lend. Don't make deals. Build some respect by not being a punk. But don't try to act tough. And most importantly, don't trust anyone. Not the guards, not other inmates, not even me. Everyone in here is looking out for themselves. You forget that, you're going to get hurt." It was good advice, and Maduro took it seriously. Over the next few days, he established a routine: wake up for count, eat breakfast quickly, and return to his cell. Avoid the day room during peak hours, when gang activity was highest. Exercise alone in the recreation yard when possible. Speak when spoken to, but don't initiate conversations. Read whatever books were available in the sparse library. Write letters to his attorney, detailing his conditions and concerns. The letters were one of his few connections to the outside world. Marcus Richardson visited once during the first week, speaking with Maduro in a small attorney conference room that provided barely more privacy than the visiting room. "How are you holding up?" Richardson asked, his expression suggesting he could already see the answer in Maduro's face. "It's difficult," Maduro admitted. "There are gang members here who hold me responsible for problems in their home countries. I've received threats, nothing specific yet, but the atmosphere is hostile. I can file a motion for protective custody. Get you moved to isolated housing. Would that help my case? Make me look weak?" Richardson considered this. It might affect jury perception if it became public that you needed protection from other inmates. Prosecutors could use it to argue that even criminals view you as particularly heinous. On the other hand, if you get seriously hurt in here, that could delay trial and complicate everything. It's a strategic decision. "I'll stay in general population for now," Maduro decided. "But I need you to document everything. Every threat, every incident. If this facility fails to protect me, that should be part of the record." "Agreed. Now regarding your case, the prosecution has turned over additional discovery. More recordings, more financial documents. Mr. Maduro, I have to be honest with you. The evidence is overwhelming. We need to start seriously considering a cooperation deal. I know you've refused so far, but the answer is still no. Even if refusing means spending the rest of your life in places like this." Richardson gestured at the bleak conference room, at the guards visible through the window, at the whole machinery of incarceration that surrounded them. Maduro thought about the past week. The constant fear, the humiliation, the grinding monotony, broken only by moments of acute stress when gang members decided to test or threaten him. The knowledge that this could be his existence for decades. And he thought about what cooperation would mean. Betraying everyone who had trusted him. Providing information that would lead to arrests and prosecutions of people who were still free. Becoming an informant, a traitor, a man who saved himself by destroying others. "Even then," Maduro said quietly, "I'd rather die in here with my integrity than live as a rat." Richardson sighed. "I understand. I don't agree, but I understand. We'll proceed to trial then. I'll do everything I can to challenge the evidence, but you need to prepare yourself for the likelihood of conviction." The meeting ended, and Maduro was escorted back to his unit. As he walked through the corridors, he passed a group of inmates being led the opposite direction. One of them, a heavily tattooed man with gang markings, made eye contact and drew a finger across his throat in an unmistakable gesture. Maduro kept walking, kept his expression neutral, but his heart was racing. That evening, during dinner, the threats became more explicit. The same MS-13 member who had invited him to play dominoes approached his table. "We heard something interesting, Maduro. Word is that you're refusing to cooperate with the feds, that you're not snitching, not making deals. Is that true?" Maduro nodded. "I'm not cooperating." "Good, because we got a message for you. There's people on the outside, people connected to the cartels you fucked over, and they're watching this case real close. If you keep your mouth shut, if you go to trial without rolling on anyone, they might leave your family alone. Your daughter, your relatives still in Venezuela. But if you start cooperating, if you start giving up names and information, bad things are going to happen to people you care about. You understand?" It was a direct threat, not just against Maduro himself, but against his family. The cartels were using prison gang networks to send a message. "Keep silent, or your loved ones will suffer." "I understand," Maduro said, his voice steady despite the fear. "And I've already told my attorney I'm not cooperating. That's not going to change." "Good, because we'll be watching. And if we hear different, you're going to have problems in here. You can't imagine. This place can be real dangerous for someone who doesn't have friends to protect them." The gang member walked away, and Maduro sat frozen at the table. He'd thought refusing to cooperate was about principle, about maintaining some shred of integrity. But now, it was also about survival. If he changed his mind, if he decided that cooperation was worth reducing his sentence, the cartels would retaliate against his family, and the gangs in here would retaliate against him. He was trapped between multiple threats, with no good options. Back in the cell, Rodriguez was unusually talkative. "I heard about the MS-13 thing. The threat against your family. That's how they operate. They can't get to you directly. You're too high profile. Guards would investigate if something happened to you. But your family, easy targets. And once they make a threat like that, you have to take it seriously. They'll follow through. So what do I do?" Maduro asked, feeling the weight of impossible choices. "Exactly what you're already doing. Keep your mouth shut. Don't cooperate. Survive until trial. And pray that you get a sentence that eventually ends rather than life without parole. Because if you get life, and you're stuck in federal prison forever, those gang connections will haunt you for however many years you've got left." Maduro lay on his bunk that night, thinking about the week that had passed. 7 days ago, he'd been a president with power and status, and the illusion of security. Now he was prisoner, 3647-2MID054, sharing a cell with a stranger, threatened by gang members, facing decades in facilities that made this one look comfortable by comparison. And he had months of this ahead of him before trial even started. The trial itself could last weeks. The appeals process could take years. And at the end of it all, he would almost certainly spend the rest of his life in prison, never again knowing freedom or dignity, or even basic privacy. The question that haunted him in the darkness was whether he could survive it, whether his mind and spirit could endure decades of this kind of existence, or whether eventually, prison would break him in ways that no amount of willpower could prevent. By the end of the first week, Maduro had learned the rhythms and rules of MDC Brooklyn, when to speak and when to stay silent, which inmates to avoid and which could be approached carefully, how to move through the facility with minimal interaction, how to endure the daily humiliations without losing his sense of self. But he'd also learned something darker, that former presidents were just men in here, that status and power meant nothing behind these walls, and that the justice system's punishment extended far beyond whatever sentence a judge might eventually impose. The real punishment was this: day after day of degradation, fear, and hopelessness, the slow erosion of everything that made him human, the transformation from a person into a number, from a leader into prey. And it had only been 1 week. He had months ahead of him in this facility, and potentially decades beyond that in worse places. The first week at MDC Brooklyn hadn't killed him, but it had taught him that there were many ways to die in prison, and some of them happened while you were still breathing.